The greatest pain was not the betrayal, but the voice that uttered it, my own son's. I thought life had taught me everything, but the worst lesson came when I least expected it. What happened after he said those words to me, no one ever believed. I promise you the revelation that's about to come will shock you, because my inheritance was not what he expected, not by a long shot. The ground disappeared beneath my feet. It was as if, all of a sudden, the man I raised with all my love had become a stranger. One of my aged hands felt the weight of the engagement ring I had always worn, but the other felt the absence of the respect he should have had. If the person you trust most betrayed you like that, in your own home, what would you do? Don't leave until you hear the last sentence, because if you miss this lesson, you might never get a chance to understand the true value of a family. And when all seemed lost, I took my will, changed a single sentence, and that's how my revenge changed everything forever. My name is Eleanor Miller, I'm 78 years old, and I've always lived in the same seaside village on the coast of New England. I was a seamstress my entire life, one of those who still measure fabric with a cloth tape measure and keep buttons in old cookie tins. A widow for over 20 years, I continued to take care of the house I built with my husband, a simple whitewashed cottage full of black and white portraits and wooden furniture that still creaks when someone sits down. It was in this space that I felt safe, between the smell of brewed coffee and the sound of the sea in the distance, reminding me every day that life can be hard, but also beautiful. My routine was predictable and, in a way, comfortable. I would wake up early, make coffee, sweep the porch, and get my sewing machine ready for a neighbor who needed a repair or a hem. During quieter hours, I dedicated myself to embroidering things for my grandchildren, small, colorful details that I believed would one day become part of their memory. On Sundays, the house would be more lively, because my son Jonathan would visit with his wife, Valerie, and their 2 boys. I always set the table as if it were a celebration, because seeing my family together was still what gave me breath. On that particular Sunday, the heat was heavy, the kind that sticks to your skin and makes even the wind seem lazy. I had put clean tablecloths on the table and left the stew simmering, waiting for the boys to come running to hug me. But instead, I saw Jonathan come through the door with a tense face, his eyebrows furrowed as if he were carrying a storm inside him. Valerie came right behind, impeccable as always, with her lips painted red and that cold stare that never quite blended with my way of being. I felt in the air that it was not a regular visit. Jonathan didn't hug me as usual. He just threw his keys on the table and took a deep breath, like someone who needed to explode. The boys ran to the yard, oblivious to what was happening, and Valerie settled into a chair with the haste of someone who was already expecting a show. I, still in my apron, sat down slowly, trying to decipher what was about to happen. My heart was already beating fast, not because of the heat, but because of the strange silence that took over the room. It was Jonathan who broke the silence, saying he needed to talk to me, seriously. He explained that he had a business project, something that, according to him, could save the family from future difficulties. He spoke quickly, mixing terms I didn't quite understand, but the urgency in his voice made it clear that it wasn't just a dream, but a plea for help. Deep down, I already knew what was coming: money. It was always about that when the tone of the conversation changed. Calmly, I asked how much he needed. The answer was a large amount, much more than I could spare without compromising everything I had. I took a deep breath and told the truth. I couldn't give him that amount, but I could help in other ways, by talking, advising, even by sewing to save up a little more. That's when I saw Valerie's eyes gleam, not with emotion, but with anger. She leaned forward and shot back, with a cutting voice. "You've always been stingy, hoarding the little you have as if it were a treasure, but you don't care about your own grandchildren's future." Those words burned more than any summer sun. Before I could reply, Jonathan, my son, the boy I carried, in my arms and taught to walk, endorsed the attack. In a harsh tone, he looked directly at me and said, "You don't deserve anything you have, Mom. All you've done is hold back my future." The words echoed in my head like breaking glass. I felt as if the ground had given way, as if all the sacrifices I had made had been reduced to dust in seconds. I stood motionless, looking at him without recognizing the man in front of me. It wasn't just the fury on his face, it was the coldness in his eyes, as if I were an obstacle, and not the mother who raised him with so much effort. In that instant, a heavy silence fell between us, but inside me something began to transform. It hurt, yes, like it had never hurt before. But in the midst of that pain, a silent decision began to be born. I would not let those words be the end of my story. And I remembered the will locked in my bedroom drawer, a document that until then was just a precaution, but which now took on a new meaning. After that phrase that, cut through me like a razor, time seemed to drag on. I could still smell the stew on the stove coming from the kitchen, but it was as if everything had become distant, irrelevant in the face of my son's words. My heart was pounding, and I noticed my hands trembling on my apron, as if they were trying to hold on to a life that was slipping through my fingers. I wanted to say something, anything to show that I was not the selfish woman they were painting me as, but the words just wouldn't come out. The silence in the room became so thick that even the creak of Valerie's chair when she leaned back sounded like an insult. The house that had always been my refuge, at that moment, seemed to have transformed into a trap where I was being judged without the right to a defense. When I finally managed to take a deep breath, I looked at Jonathan and tried to find, in some corner of his face, the boy he once was. I remembered the times he would come running from school, with scraped knees and sparkling eyes, and I would apply the ointment, singing softly to calm him down. I remembered the nights I sewed until dawn to buy him his first guitar, because he said he wanted to learn music. None of that seemed to have any weight now, in the face of the coldness I saw in his eyes. It was as if all the memories we had built had been erased at once, replaced by a blind and merciless ambition. Valerie wasted no time in fanning that fire. Of course she's never going to help, Jonathan. Your mom has always thought more of herself than of you. That's why her life has never left this place. I heard that, and felt as if I was being stabbed with words. I never needed luxury, nor did I want it. But to hear my house, my way of life, being used against me was cruel. I knew she never held me in high regard, but to witness my own son agreeing with that view was more than I could bear. Still, I didn't scream. I didn't raise my voice. I remained silent, observing, and inside me something was moving, like a tide that recedes before a giant wave. I got up slowly, without haste, and just said I needed to check the stove so the stew wouldn't burn. It was an excuse, of course. In reality, I needed to breathe. I needed to get away from that gaze that was piercing through me as if I were a burden. I went into the kitchen and leaned on the sink, letting the tears come uncontrollably. But they were not just tears of despair. It was a mix of pain and something new, a determination that was emerging right there, between sobs. I remembered the locked drawer in my room, where I kept the will I had written years ago, still in firm handwriting, when I decided it was important to leave everything organized. Until that day, I saw it as a precaution to avoid future fights. Now, that paper seemed like a shield. While I was wiping my face with a dish towel, I heard low voices in the living room. They were talking about me as if I were no longer present, as if I were just an obstacle in a business conversation. Jonathan said that maybe it was time to sell the house, and my blood ran cold. That house was not just walls and a roof. It was the last piece of my husband. It was where I raised my son, where I sewed every inch of our life. The idea of seeing everything reduced to a number, to a negotiation, revolted me like few things had before. And right there I realized, my son didn't just want money. He wanted to tear my own history from me. I came back to the living room with my face already clean, but my eyes still teary. I sat down again, and instead of arguing, I just watched. I saw how Jonathan avoided looking at me, preferring to look at his own hands. I saw how Valerie stood up as if she had already won a battle. And for the first time, I felt a strange calm. I already knew what I needed to do. It wouldn't be at that moment. It wouldn't be in the middle of that fight. But the decision had already been made inside me. The humiliation I suffered in that room would not go unanswered. At that instant, the boys came running back from the yard, bringing an innocent energy that seemed not to fit in the gravity of that environment. They hugged me, asking for cake, and I welcomed them as I always did, with a smile that hid the whole storm. I looked at them and thought that maybe they were the real reason for everything, the true heirs of something that is not measured in money, but in dignity. The weight of Jonathan's words still hurt, but seeing my grandchildren reminded me that life goes on, and that I still had an important role to play. Lunch was served in silence. Each spoonful of stew seemed to go down my throat with difficulty. I watched the faces at the table and realized that something had broken between us. It was no longer just a misunderstanding. It was a deep chasm, difficult to close. I finished my meal in silence, eating slowly, while I was already planning what I would do when they left. It wasn't revenge I was feeling, but justice. I would not allow my life to be reduced to a transaction. The will that was kept in my room would become my answer, a message that would remain for after I was gone, but which would echo strongly in the memory of those who today dared to call me stingy. When dessert was over and the children went back to playing in the yard, I felt that the weight of their presence finally gave me some breathing room. But the tension between us adults remained dense, as if the air had become too heavy to breathe. Valerie got up first, arranging her purse on her shoulder and saying they had commitments, while looking at Jonathan, expecting him to end the visit. My son, without a single word of affection, just mumbled a "thanks for lunch" and gave me a dry, resentful look. The scene hurt me even more because I knew that this was not a fleeting argument. Something deep had been broken there. I walked them to the door, as I always did, but without the usual tenderness. The boys hugged me running, saying they would come back next weekend, without realizing the seriousness of what was happening. When they got into the car, I stood at the doorstep, watching the dust from the road rise as they drove away. The sound of the engine was gone, but inside me, the echo of those words, "You don't deserve anything you have," kept pounding like a sentence. I closed the door slowly, and for the first time in many years, I felt the loneliness of my house weigh like lead on my shoulders. I went back to the living room and looked at the table, still full of dirty dishes and half-empty glasses. It seemed that the room held the memory of the fight, impregnated with an energy that was no longer of a family, but of a courtroom. I sat down again in the chair where I had heard those words and let the tears roll. I cried not only for what was said, but for all that it meant. The ingratitude, the blindness, the contempt for everything I built with so much effort. I felt small, invisible, as if my whole life had been reduced to an obstacle. But in the midst of the pain, a flame of resistance began to ignite. I decided then that I would not wait for time to heal it. Time, I knew, would only deepen the wounds if I didn't take action. I got up, washed my face, and went up to my room. I opened the locked drawer of the dresser, the one I rarely touched, and took out the leather folder where I kept important documents. Among them was my will, written years ago at the county courthouse in the next town over, in still firm and clear handwriting. I ran my fingers over the paper, feeling every word as if it had been written exactly for that day. It was as if I had predicted, without knowing it, that this pain would come one day, and that I would need to be prepared. I sat on the edge of the bed, with the document in my hands, and reread every line. My will was not grand. The house, some savings, a few small plots of land inherited from my parents. But what was written there was not about wealth. It was about justice, about making it clear who really valued my history. Even back then, I had made the decision to divide the inheritance in a different way, leaving the largest part to my grandchildren and allocating only a small fraction to Jonathan. I knew that this could one day be a source of conflict, but at that moment, the certainty inside me was absolute. I had been right. Still on that Sunday, I realized I needed to revise some details. I didn't just want to leave a material, inheritance, but also a message, something that would remain as a lesson. I spent the rest of the afternoon writing a letter, in my own hand, explaining my choices. I didn't use words of resentment, nor of revenge. I wrote with the same firmness with which I had sewed my whole life, line by line, stitch by stitch. In it, I said that everything I did was for the good of the family, that sacrifices were not few, and that true wealth is not in money, but in respect. While I was writing, I felt a strange peace. It was as if, finally, I had regained control of my own story. Outside, the sun was setting slowly, tinging the sky with orange and pink, and the sound of the sea came softly through the half-open window. I thought of my husband, how much he would have suffered if he had witnessed that scene, and I promised myself that I would not let his memory be stained by ingratitude. The will now was not just a legal paper. It was my voice. It was a way of ensuring that my life was not erased by selfishness. I put the letter with the will and closed the folder again, locking the drawer firmly. When I lay down that night, the weight was still in my chest, but it was different. It was no longer just pain. It was also a decision. I didn't know what the next Sunday would be like, or if Jonathan would contact me again. But I knew that, no matter what happened, I had already taken the necessary action. My story would not be silenced, and my legacy would not be shaped by ingratitude. For the first time that day, I was able to close my eyes and sleep in peace. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The sun hadn't even fully risen, but I was already sitting on the porch, listening to the sound of the first boats returning from fishing. The smell of the sea, which had always brought me comfort, at that hour seemed to remind me that life is made of cycles, of coming and going, of tides that take and bring back. I made my coffee, sat in silence, and looked at the empty road, trying to imagine what the next encounter with my son would be like. Inside me, there was an open wound, but also a certainty. I could no longer be the same Eleanor as before, the one who silently accepted harsh words and let others decide for her. While I was drinking my coffee, I thought about how every corner of my house held memories. The rocking chair where my husband read the newspaper, the shelf with the yellowed photographs of my parents, the wall full of frames with the embroideries I had made over the years. Everything there was a part of me, and the simple idea of someone talking about selling the house gave me chills. It wasn't just brick and cement, it was the home that sheltered my joys and sorrows. It was the place where I sewed clothes for neighbors, where I taught Jonathan to walk, where I cried in secret so many times. I knew I couldn't allow that to be treated as a bargaining chip. I decided then to go to the next town over that very day. I put on, a simple dress, tied my hair in a firm bun, and took the bus that ran on the dirt road. The journey was long, but I already knew every curve, every piece of sand that accumulated on the banks. On the way, I observed the other people: fishmongers, housewives carrying bags, workers going to the port, each one with their own struggle, each one with their own dignity. And there I was, a 78-year-old woman, with a document in my purse and a decision that would change the destiny of my family. I arrived at the courthouse in the morning, and the heat was already being felt. The thick walls and the noisy fan barely disguised the stuffy feeling. I greeted the clerk, an old man who had known me for a long time, and asked to revise my will. He looked at me with some surprise, perhaps thinking that at this point in my life, I would no longer have reasons to mess with something like that. But I did, and many. I sat in front of him, handed him the document, and calmly explained that I needed to add an explanatory letter, attaching it officially, so that there would be no doubt about my intentions. While he read what I had written the night before, I stayed there observing the details of the room, the sound of the pages being turned, the dust dancing in the beams of light that came through the window, the smell of old paper. It was as if everything was reminding me that what I was doing there was not just bureaucracy, it was an act of courage. When he finished, he looked at me with respect and said, "Mrs. Miller, your words are firm. This will make what you wish clear." I felt a sense of relief take over my chest, as if a huge stone had been lifted from my back. On the way back home, the bus was more crowded. A small boy was dozing on his mother's lap, and I was thinking about how fragile life is and, at the same time, how resilient. I remembered my grandchildren and their warm hug the day before. It was for them that I was doing all that. If one day they grew up without understanding, at least my words in the will could show them who I was and what I believed. I smiled to myself, looking out the window, as the dirt road stretched until it disappeared on the horizon. Arriving home, I felt a tiredness mixed with lightness. I put my purse on the table, took off my shoes, and walked through the living room as if I were re-examining every detail for the first time. I ran my hand over the arm of the chair where Jonathan had sat, and a pang of pain returned. But it was no longer the same as yesterday. It was a pain that was transforming into strength. I prepared a simple dish of rice and fish, ate lunch alone, and then went back to my sewing. The sound of the machine brought me back to my routine, as if each stitch was a way of also sewing up the cracks in my heart. In the afternoon, while I was embroidering a towel with blue flowers, I heard knocks on the door. My heart raced instantly, imagining it could be Jonathan coming back to argue. But, to my relief, it was just the neighbor, Mrs. Harrison, bringing a piece of freshly baked cornbread. We sat on the porch, had coffee together, and she, without knowing anything, began to talk about life, the harvests, her children. I listened to her carefully, but at the same time I realized how that simple moment had immense value. This was what I wanted to surround myself with: people who shared, who added, who brought lightness. not those who belittled me. The following days were silent. Jonathan didn't call, Valerie didn't send messages, and not even the boys came running through the gate as they used to. Their absence hurt, of course, but at the same time, it offered me a space to reflect. I spent more time on the porch, listening to the sea and sewing simple clothes for the neighbors as I always did. I realized that loneliness had two sides, that of longing, but also that of freedom. It was strange to admit, but after that afternoon of humiliation, I no longer felt such a need to have my house full every Sunday. The emptiness at that moment seemed more honest than a presence loaded with resentment. Still, I couldn't help but think about what had happened to my son. Was the business really real, or just an excuse to extract what was left of me? I knew Jonathan well, perhaps even better than he would have liked. He always had big dreams, but little patience to wait for the right time. As a child, he wanted to get on his father's boat before he even knew how to swim. As a young man, he wanted to make money fast without understanding that things take years to flourish. And now, as an adult, he seemed to be repeating the same steps, always in a hurry, always believing that someone should give up something so he could succeed. The nights were the hardest. I would lie in bed, and the silence of the house would turn into memories. His words would come back like a tide, hitting me again and again. You don't deserve anything you have. It was impossible not to relive. That moment, and every time I remembered, it seemed that my heart hurt in a different spot. But it was also on those nights that I began to strengthen the decision within me. If I had spent my whole life sewing threads that broke, I could also sew the direction of my own story. And that direction now would not allow my legacy to be diluted by the ambition of someone who didn't know how to value it. On Friday of that same week, I went to the town market to buy fruits and vegetables. The movement, the sound of voices calling out to customers, the smell of fresh fish mixed with spices, all that brought me a certain relief. Simple people, each one taking care of their own life, exchanging coins, laughter, and complaints about the heat. There, no one judged me. No one belittled me. I was just Mrs. Miller the seamstress, the same as ever. Carrying my full bags, I realized that there was still a lot of value in the small things, in the routines that reminded me of who I really was. On the way back, I met old Mr. Evans, a fisherman who had known my husband since he was a boy. He greeted me with a toothless smile and asked about my grandchildren. I hesitated for a moment, but replied that they were well. I didn't want to expose the pain I was carrying. He commented on how hard life is, but that, in the end, what remains is the memory of what we do for people. That phrase kept echoing in me during the entire trip back. Maybe it was a reminder that the love I had given throughout my life could never be erased, even if it wasn't recognized at that moment. On Saturday night, while I was tidying up the house, I heard footsteps on the road. For a moment, I thought it was Jonathan, but it was just a group of young people laughing loudly on their way to the beach. I sighed with relief, but my heart still raced just thinking about a reunion. I didn't know what it would be like when he came back. Would he come with anger, demanding more money? Or would he come, remorseful, asking for forgiveness? Deep down, I feared indifference more than anger, because anger still carries emotion, but indifference is like a bottomless pit. On Sunday, I woke up before the sun and began to prepare the house, as if I were expecting visitors. I put a clean tablecloth on the table, made fresh coffee, and left the stew on the stove. I didn't know if they would come, but the habit of years was hard to abandon. The clock kept ticking, and with each hour that passed, hope diminished. At noon, I realized they wouldn't come. I sat alone at the table, served my plate, and ate in silence. The taste of the food was the same, but the absence around me was deafening. It was at that moment that I realized I needed, once and for all, to learn to live for myself. After lunch, I decided to go to the village church. I sat in the last pew, listening to the gentle hymns that echoed through the space. I didn't go to seek divine consolation, but a little peace within myself. I looked at the images, at the lit candles, and thought about how many mothers had already cried for their children without ever receiving recognition. I left there feeling lighter, as if I had left part of the pain on the altar. I walked back home with slow steps, and the sea breeze accompanied me. I knew that life would still bring me new challenges, but I also knew that I already had the strength inside me to resist. The following week began like all the others, with the sound of seagulls flying over the sea and the smell of fresh coffee filling the kitchen. But there was something different in the air, a feeling that something was about to happen. I spent the morning sewing a skirt for Mrs. Harrison, trying to distract myself, but the needle seemed to slip from my hand more than usual. It was as if my intuition knew that that Sunday would not end in silence like the previous one. And I was right. Towards the end of the afternoon, I heard the sound of a car stopping in front of my house. My heart raced, my hands got cold, and for a moment I thought about not opening the door. When I approached the window, I saw Jonathan getting out of the car alone. He didn't bring Valerie or the boys, and that already seemed like a sign to me. The way he walked, with his shoulders slumped and his head down, was not the same arrogant man from the previous week, but even so, inside me, the open wound did not allow me to relax. I took a deep breath, wiped my hands on my apron, and opened the door calmly. He came in without asking permission, like someone who knows every corner, but at the same time seemed uncomfortable, as if he were a visitor in unfamiliar territory. We sat in the living room, face to face. The silence was long, awkward, until he mumbled an almost inaudible, "I'm sorry." It wasn't enough, not for the weight of what had been said, but at least it was a start. I remained silent, waiting for him to continue. He then ran his hands over his face, sighed deeply, and said he was desperate. He said the business hadn't worked out, that he had lost money, and that he was full of debt. He spoke quickly, tripping over his words, like someone carrying a huge burden and trying to get rid of it by dumping it on someone else. I listened to everything in silence, without interrupting. Every sentence of his seemed to confirm what I already suspected. There was no great project, just another poorly planned shortcut, a result of the impatience that had accompanied him his whole life. He said he needed help, that only I could save him. When he finished, he looked at me with teary eyes, as if he expected me to open a drawer and take out a ready-made solution. And at that instant, I realized that my answer would define not only that moment, but the future of all of us. I took a deep breath and said calmly, "Jonathan, I am not a bank, nor a vault. I am your mother. What I had to give, I have already given my whole life. I gave my time, my youth, my sleepless nights. I gave everything I could, but I cannot, and I don't want to, sustain your mistakes forever." I saw his face contort with pain, as if those words were harsher than his had been to me, but it was necessary. I could no longer pretend the problem didn't exist. He tried to insist, said he was about to lose the house he lived in, that Valerie couldn't take it anymore, that the boys needed stability. I listened to him, but deep down, I had already made my decision. I got up, went to the dresser, and brought the leather folder. I placed it on the table, without opening it, and said, "Inside here is the answer to everything. Maybe not the one you expect, but the one that will be valid when I am no longer here." He looked at the folder as if it were an enigma. He wanted to open it right away, but I placed my hand over his and said it wasn't the time. I explained that that document was not just a will, it was also a lesson. I told him that I had already revised everything and attached a letter so that no one would interpret it the wrong way. I said that the grandchildren would be the main beneficiaries because they still had their future ahead of them, and that he, as my son, would only receive enough so he couldn't say he was forgotten. "It's not punishment, Jonathan," I said firmly. "It's a consequence. Whoever doesn't know how to take care of what they have will never learn if they continue to receive everything on a silver platter." He lowered his eyes, and for the first time in a long time I saw in him not anger, but shame. The silence that followed was heavy, but different from the previous weeks. It was no longer a silence of rupture, but of reflection. Jonathan remained seated for a few minutes, looking at his own hands, without the courage to face me. I, for my part, felt that I had done what I needed to. Not with shouts, not with hate, but with the firmness of someone who knows the value of their own life. When he finally got up to leave, he gave me a quick kiss on the forehead, as he did when he was a boy. It was a small gesture, but it carried an immense weight, and I knew, right there, that my decision was on the right path. When the door closed behind Jonathan that night, I stood still for a few moments in the living room, listening only to the creak of the gate and the distant sound of the car driving away. The house seemed to breathe in silence, as if it had also participated in that conversation and now needed to recompose itself. I walked to the window and looked at the dark road, thinking about the weight of the words we had exchanged. Part of me felt sad for having to be so tough, but another part, the firmest one, knew that I had done what I needed to. It was not only for me, it was for him too. Sometimes, loving a son means setting boundaries, even if it hurts the mother more than it does him. That night, I had trouble falling asleep. I lay in bed and looked at the ceiling, remembering when Jonathan was little and was afraid of the dark. I would sit beside him and sing softly until he fell asleep peacefully. Now, it was he who seemed lost in the darkness, but I could no longer hold his hand as I used to. He needed to learn to face his own ghosts alone. This thought brought silent tears, but also a certain relief. I had done my part, and now it was up to him to decide what to do with it. The next day, I resumed my routine as usual. I made coffee, swept the porch, and sat down to sew. But I realized that there was something different in me. It was as if a part of the weight I was carrying had dissolved. The conversation with Jonathan, although painful, gave me the feeling that I had regained control of my own story. I no longer saw myself as a victim of ingratitude, but as someone who had chosen to react. It was strange, almost contradictory, to feel peace in the middle of the storm, but that was exactly what I felt on that sunny morning. During the week, the neighbors came as usual to pick up orders or just chat. I would smile, offer coffee, and no one imagined the silent war that was going on inside my family. Deep down, I was grateful for that. The simple life of the village helped me remember that, despite everything, the world kept turning. The tides didn't stop because of a mother's pain, the boats kept coming back with fish, and the wind kept blowing. This normalcy sustained me, reminded me that I was not alone in the universe, that my pain was just one among so many that everyone carries. It was on Thursday, late in the afternoon, that I received an unexpected phone call. It was Jonathan. His voice was choked up, almost unrecognizable. He didn't ask for money this time, didn't talk about debts or business. He just said, "Mom, I've thought a lot about what you said. I think I needed to hear that." I was silent for a few seconds, because my heart seemed to have stopped beating. I expected resistance, anger, even a definitive distancing. But hearing those words was like feeling a thread of hope rekindle, fragile, but real. I talked to him for a few minutes. We didn't talk about the will, or assets, or the future, just about simple things, like the boy's health, his work, the heat in the village. It was almost like going back in time, when we could still talk without hidden weights. When I hung up, I looked at the phone in my hands, reflecting on how life comes full circle. Maybe that was just a small opening, but it was enough to show me that the seed of change had been planted. On Saturday, when I went to the market again, I met some mothers I knew who were talking about their children with pride. I listened, smiled, but inside me, there was a mixture of feelings. Pride and pain coexisted side by side. I knew that Jonathan had a lot to learn, but I also knew that in some way, my words had started to have an effect, and that gave me the strength to move forward. I came home with my bags, full, but with a lighter heart than in recent weeks. On that Sunday, to my surprise, Jonathan appeared again, this time accompanied only by the boys. They ran to me, hugging my legs and laughing as always. I felt immense joy to see that, at least for them, nothing had changed. Jonathan came in slowly, with a different expression, calmer, almost humble. There was no Valerie to poison the words, no demands on the tip of his tongue. Just him, my son, trying to rebuild a bridge that had almost collapsed. And at that moment, I realized that life was offering me the chance to heal not only my pain, but also his. I set the table as I always did, but this time the gesture had a different weight. As I was setting the plates and adjusting the floral tablecloth, I noticed my hands were trembling slightly, not from tiredness, but from the expectation of what that lunch would mean. Jonathan was sitting in the living room, watching the boys play in the yard, and he seemed lost in his own thoughts. I, from inside the kitchen, watched him discreetly, and for the first time in a long time, I was able to see in him not just the harsh and impatient man who had hurt me, but also that boy who one day held my hand in fear of the dark. The boys came running in, asking for cake even before lunch, and we laughed together at that scene. Their innocence filled the house in a way that even the heavy silence of the previous week had not managed to erase. When everyone sat down at the table, the atmosphere was different. There were no shouts, accusations, or demands. The sound of the cutlery hitting the plates seemed like music. I served the stew and rice, and Jonathan accepted in silence, thanking me softly. Every gesture of his, no matter how simple, seemed to carry a new intention, a timid attempt at reconciliation. During the meal, I risked starting a conversation about simple things. I asked about his work, the boys' school, even the weather in the city. He replied calmly, without rushing, as if he were choosing every word not to spoil that moment. There were long pauses between the sentences, but they were pauses that didn't hurt. They were spaces where reflection could fit. I felt that, little by little, we were rebuilding something. It wouldn't be overnight, I knew, but it was the beginning of a path that might still lead us back to a place of respect. After lunch, I took the boys to the yard and we watched the chickens scratching and the boats returning to the sea. They asked me questions about when I was young, what it was like to play in that same dirt, and I told them simple stories, but full of life. Meanwhile, I noticed Jonathan standing at the door, watching us in silence. His gaze, for the first time in a long time, was not one of demands or indifference. It was a look laden with something I hadn't seen in years. Longing. Longing for when we were just mother and son, without the complications of adult life. When the boys ran to the neighboring yard, I took the opportunity to talk to Jonathan alone. I asked if he had thought about what I said during the last visit. He sighed deeply, leaned his elbows on the table, and said, "Mom, I know I was wrong. I was too harsh, but I was desperate and didn't see any other way out." His words didn't erase the pain I felt, but they opened a crack. I listened to him carefully and replied with firmness, "Desperation does not justify disrespect, Jonathan. I am your mother, not your enemy. Everything I have, I built with sweat. I won't accept that it's treated as nothing." He lowered his head and was silent for a few moments. The distant sound of the sea filled the space between us, as if nature itself wanted to mediate the conversation. Then he looked me in the eyes and said, "I understand, Mom. I don't want to talk about money anymore. I just don't want you to push me away for good." I couldn't bear that. Those words hit me hard, because behind them there was a real fear, the fear of losing not only the inheritance, but also his mother. And there I realized that my firmness had had an effect. I held his hand calmly and said that I had no intention of pushing him away, but that I needed to be respected. "What I have written will remain, Jonathan. I will not change it. But that doesn't mean we can't rebuild our relationship while I'm alive. What's on paper is for later, but what matters is what we do now." I saw discreet tears well up in his eyes, and that brought me a relief I hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time, he seemed to be really listening to me. When the sun began to set, the tired boys lay down on the sofa, and Jonathan got up to leave. Before leaving, he hugged me tightly, like he hadn't in years. It was a silent hug, but full of meaning. I felt the weight of the grievances still present, but also the promise of a different future. I closed the door behind him with a light heart, knowing that the battle was not won, but at least we were no longer on opposite sides. And at that moment, I understood that my will was not just a message for the future. It was the compass that was helping to guide the present. The following months brought a different routine. Jonathan began to show up more often, almost always alone or just with the boys. I noticed that Valerie's absence was not a coincidence. She clearly did not want to be in my house after the last discussion. At first, I confess I found it strange that Jonathan came without his wife, but over time I began to understand that, in a way, that was also his choice. It was as if he wanted to rescue the relationship with me and the children without the interference of her cold gaze. And that attitude, even if discreet, was the first sign that he was willing to change. Each visit was different. Sometimes he would come for lunch. At others, just to bring the boys and let them run in the yard. Little by little, the silence that had settled between us gave way to simple, almost trivial, conversations, but which carried a new depth. We talked about the sea, about life in the village, about the difficulties each of us faced. I noticed that Jonathan no longer talked about money, didn't mention debts, didn't hint at miraculous business deals. It was as if he had understood that the relationship between us could not be based on interests, but on respect and presence. Of course, not everything was easy. Valerie, for example, stopped talking to me completely. She didn't call me, didn't show up, didn't send messages. It was as if she had excluded me from her world, perhaps believing that I didn't deserve a place in the life she had built with Jonathan. Deep down, I knew that her resentment came from the fact that she hadn't gotten what she wanted, control over what I owned. This distance only hurt me because of the boys, because I knew that sooner or later, she might try to poison their minds as well. Even so, I remained firm. Whenever Jonathan came, I made a point of showing that my affection for my grandchildren was immense and unshakable. I played with them in the yard, taught them to plant beans in little cans, showed them how to mend a piece of clothing. Small gestures that I knew would be stored in their memory. Because more than leaving an inheritance of assets, I wanted to leave them with memories that no money could buy. And every time they laughed out loud, running around the porch, I felt that I was succeeding. One particular Sunday stood out. Jonathan arrived earlier, bringing a fresh fish he had gotten at the market. He asked to prepare the meal himself, something he had never done before. I watched from the kitchen as he cut the fish, a little clumsy, and smiled at the boys around him. It was a simple gesture, but for me it had immense value. It was as if, finally, he was learning to build without expecting everything to be handed to him. That day, we ate a meal together that tasted of reconciliation. Despite these advances, I knew that the wound was not completely healed. There were moments when Jonathan would suddenly fall silent, lost in thought, and I would realize that he was still carrying guilt and shame. I didn't pressure him, didn't demand anything. I just let time do its work. Life taught me that certain pains don't disappear overnight, but they can be transformed into learning. And somehow, I wanted him to come to the conclusion of what he had done and what he still needed to change on his own. Meanwhile, I remained firm in my purpose with the will. I did not change a single line of what I had written, or the letter I had attached. I knew that that document was proof that I had not been weak, that I had not let a son's pride destroy the story of a lifetime. But I also understood that it wasn't just about the paper. The true will I was leaving every day, in the teachings, in the conversations, in the boundaries I was now setting with firmness. It was this stance, more than any inheritance, that would shape the future of my family. There were days when I thought about what it would have been like if I had given in on that first Sunday, if I had given Jonathan the money he asked for. Maybe he would have sunk even deeper into debt. Maybe he would never have seen the mistakes he was making. I realized then that a mother's love is not in always saying yes, but in knowing when to say no. That thought gave me the strength to stay firm, even in the face of Valerie's absences, veiled criticisms, and the gossip that ran through the village. I knew my decision was fair, and that conviction became clearer and clearer with each new Sunday that I saw my son trying to be different. As the months went by, I began to notice that Valerie's absence was not just carelessness, but a conscious choice. The few times we crossed paths in town, she wouldn't even look at me, pretending not to see me. This forced silence was more painful than if she had attacked me with words. I knew that coldness was a form of retaliation, an attempt to show me that I no longer had a place in her life. However, inside me, something had changed. I no longer felt afraid of that contempt. On the contrary, I felt that her distance gave me even more freedom to be who I was, without having to please at all costs. One Sunday, however, Jonathan arrived accompanied by her. When I saw her walking through the gate, I felt a tightness in my chest, but I kept my face firm. Valerie came in with confident steps, the same cold stare, and sat down without greeting me. The atmosphere became heavy immediately, as if the air had thickened. The boys, oblivious to the tension, ran to hug me, and that gave me the necessary strength to remain calm. I sat down at the table and served lunch in silence, waiting for the moment when she would finally speak. It didn't take long. Between one spoonful and another, Valerie let slip, with that cutting tone she always used. It's funny how some people prefer to spend money on courthouse paperwork instead of thinking about the real family. It was a direct attack, and I knew right away that she already knew about the will. I don't know if it was from Jonathan or from some gossip that reached her, but it was clear that the matter had come out of the shadows. I took a deep breath, adjusted my chair, and replied with firmness, "Valerie, a real family is built with respect. The rest is a consequence." The silence that followed was almost deafening. Jonathan lowered his eyes, clearly uncomfortable, and the boys stopped laughing, realizing that something was wrong. Valerie kept her gaze fixed on me, as if she was trying to intimidate me. But I was no longer the same frightened Eleanor who would cry in silence. I had learned to transform pain into firmness. So, without raising my voice, I continued. I have already written what I needed to write. What I will leave is decided. I will not change it because someone calls me stingy or selfish. Those who know me know the truth, and those who don't deserve to. She turned red, gripped the cutlery tightly, but didn't reply. Perhaps because she expected me to back down, to apologize as I had so many times in the past. But not this time. The meal ended in silence, a heavy one. But for me, it was a victory. I had said what I needed to, looking her in the eyes, without wavering. When they left that day, I felt a deep relief, as if a huge stone had been lifted from my chest. I knew that the conflict was not over, but I was certain that for the first time the position was clear. I would not give in. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and looked at the starry sky. The wind brought the salty smell of the sea, and I thought about how life had taught me, by force, that dignity is not negotiable. Maybe I had taken too long to understand that. Maybe I had given in on many things in the past. But now, at the end of my life, I would not let my story be erased by people who did not know the value of fighting. The will was just one part of it. The true legacy was my posture in the face of everything. In the following days, Jonathan came to visit me alone again. I noticed that he was quieter than usual, as if he was carrying the guilt for the conflict between me and Valerie. At one point, he risked asking if I couldn't be more flexible to avoid fights. I looked at him with tenderness, but also with firmness, and replied, "I have been flexible. My whole life, Jonathan. Now is the time to be firm, because what is at stake is not just money, it is respect." He didn't insist anymore, and that silence, for me, was a sign that, deep down, he was starting to understand. Over time, I realized that my decision was becoming a kind of watershed. For some, I was seen as stubborn, too rigid. For others, as someone courageous, who did not let herself be bent by family pressure. For me, it was just a way to ensure that, when I was no longer here, my story would be told the right way. I couldn't control Jonathan's choices or Valerie's coldness, but I could ensure that my last words, written in my own hand, made it clear what I valued most in life: justice, love, and dignity. As the weeks passed, I began to notice that the boys were becoming the true thread that kept the family together. Whenever they came, they brought life to the house, spreading laughter throughout the yard and transforming the heavy atmosphere into something lighter. I clung to those moments like someone holding a rope in the middle of a storm. They were not to blame for their parents' choices or the harsh words that echoed inside these walls. For them, I was still just the grandmother who made cornbread, told stories from when I was a girl, and let them run barefoot on the porch. And it was precisely for this reason that I knew everything I had, in the end, should be for them. One afternoon, while we were embroidering together, yes, because I even convinced the two of them to hold a needle, the older one asked me if I would always stay in that house. I smiled and said yes, that was my home and always would be. But inside, his question made me reflect on time. I knew my days were numbered. That age didn't give me guarantees. Therefore, the importance of the will grew even more. I couldn't leave anything to chance. I couldn't allow that, after I was gone, the same cruel words would come back to hurt me, even if I was no longer present, to hear them. It was in this spirit that I decided to reinforce my wishes even more. I went to the courthouse again and asked to register a copy of the letter along with a duplicate of the will, so there would be no doubts. The clerk, already used to me, listened in silence and said, "Mrs. Miller, you are firmer than many young people who come through here." I smiled slightly, but deep down I knew that it wasn't just firmness. It was a necessity. I needed to protect myself until my last breath. I needed to ensure that what I built with sweat would not be treated as a bargaining chip. Valerie, on the other hand, did not hide her discomfort. Once I saw her in passing at the market, and she couldn't hold back her venom. "You're going to regret putting those boys above everything." I swallowed hard, but replied calmly, "I prefer to regret loving too much than not loving enough." She huffed and left without looking back. Those words hurt me, but they also served as confirmation that I was on the right path. Whoever sees love as weakness could never be worthy of any inheritance. Jonathan, in turn, seemed conflicted. On some days, he would come over calmly, talk to me, show clear signs of remorse. On others, he would arrive tense, as if he were carrying the weight of his wife's demands on his shoulders. I noticed the conflict in him, but I no longer interfered. I learned that my role now was not to fix his mistakes, but to show him the boundaries. And little by little, I began to understand that perhaps this was the greatest lesson of all, teaching my son that not all love translates into unconditional giving. True love sometimes is in showing where patience ends. The boys, who were getting closer and closer, started spending weekends with me, especially when Valerie made excuses not to come. On these occasions, I felt complete again. I would prepare their breakfast with grits and pancakes, take them to the seaside to wet their feet in the sand, and tell them stories. About their grandfather they didn't know. And in each of these experiences, I knew that I was planting seeds. Maybe one day, when they were adults and remembered their childhood, it would be these memories that would guide them, much more than any material inheritance. On one of these Sundays, the younger one hugged me tightly and said, "Grandma, I want to be like you when I grow up." My eyes teared up instantly, because there was the answer I needed. What I would leave them was not just a house, a piece of land, or some money. What I would leave was character. It was an example. That phrase from my grandson kept echoing in me for days, like a balm. It was a reminder that, despite all the pains and conflicts, I had done something right. I had shown, even without words, that dignity is the most precious asset anyone can inherit. That night, as I lay down, I felt a peace that I had not experienced in a long time. I looked at the walls of the house, at the old photos of my husband, at the furniture that had withstood time, and I realized that everything had served its purpose. The house was not just a shelter. It was a testimony of a life lived with sacrifice and love. I closed my eyes with the certainty that, no matter what happened from then on, my legacy was protected. Because it was not only on the will paper, but in the hearts of those two boys who, without knowing it, became my greatest victory. The day of the final confrontation came on a muggy Sunday, one of those where the wind seems too heavy to bring relief. I already had a premonition that something was going to happen, because Jonathan had called the day before saying he would come with the whole family. The way he spoke, brief, hesitant, put me on alert. I spent the morning tidying up the house as usual, but deep down I knew that lunch would not be just another meal. It would be the moment to lay the cards on the table, to make clear, without mincing words, what was already written on paper and in my soul. When the car stopped in front of the house, I heard the doors slamming, and soon after, Valerie's firm footsteps coming through the gate. She didn't greet me, she just pulled the boys by the arm and came in with that expression of someone who had not come to share affection, but to wage a battle. Jonathan, behind her, seemed laden with tension, as if he were about to watch a fire. The atmosphere became heavy as soon as they sat down at the table. Not even the innocent laughter of my high grandchildren was able to soften the atmosphere. Valerie wasted no time. Still with an empty plate, she crossed her arms and shot back. "Mrs. Miller, I know very well what you did. That ridiculous will, that letter, it's all just to exclude me, to humiliate me. But know that I will not accept it." Her voice echoed through the room like a razor. The boys fell silent, looking from one to another without understanding. Jonathan lowered his head, clearly without the strength to intervene. I, however, took a deep breath and remained calm. I was no longer the frightened Eleanor. I was the Eleanor who had learned to raise her voice when necessary. I looked directly into her eyes and replied, "Valerie, I didn't write anything to humiliate you. What is in the will is the result of my life, my choices, and my sweat. I don't owe explanations to someone who was never with me when I needed them most. What I built with my own hands. And if I decided to leave the largest part to my grandchildren, it's because in them I still see innocence. I see a future. You can call me stingy, selfish, whatever you want, but what you cannot do is change what is already sealed." The silence that followed was dense, but I did not look away. For the first time, Valerie seemed to lose control. She tried to retort, saying that Jonathan deserved more, that I was being unfair. But I didn't let her finish. I interrupted her with firmness. "It's unfair to take away a mother's dignity. It's unfair to want to erase a lifetime of sacrifices in exchange for money. What is written is not just about assets, Valerie. It's about respect. And I never received respect from you." My words came out without a tremor, each syllable loaded with truth. Jonathan finally lifted his head. He looked at me, then at his wife, and seemed to awaken from a long torpor. "Mom is right," he said with a firm voice. "I was wrong with her. And if you can't understand what that means, Valerie, the problem is not hers, it's ours." The impact was visible. Valerie turned pale, not believing that her own husband was no longer on her side in that dispute. The boys, still confused, went back to playing, as if they felt that the worst was already over. I got up, went to the dresser, and brought the leather folder, placing it on the table between us. "Here is what bothers you so much," I said, looking at Valerie. "It's all written. There are no secrets, no tricks, just the truth of a lifetime." She remained, motionless, without the courage to open it. Jonathan also didn't move. I then continued. "One day, when I am no longer here, you will read every line. And on that day, maybe you will understand that the value of things is not in how much they cost, but in how much it costs to earn them. The conversation ended there. Valerie got up furious, quickly grabbed the boys and left, leaving Jonathan behind. He remained seated, with a tired face, but with different eyes. "Thank you, Mom," he just said. I nodded in silence. I didn't need anything else. The truth had already been told, and the future was already written. When I closed the door after he left, I felt a mixture of pain and relief. It hurt to see my family in pieces, but there was also the serenity of someone who knew they had done the right thing. I had protected my legacy, and more than that, I had protected myself. In the days that followed the confrontation, the house remained silent, but it was no longer a silence of pain. It was the silence of clarity, of the certainty that I had said everything I needed to, and that there was nothing to hide. I started walking more in the yard, taking care of my plants, and listening to the sea more calmly, as if each wave confirmed that life goes on, regardless of human quarrels. The weight I was carrying on my shoulders seemed lighter. It hurt, yes, to see Valerie distant and resentful, but inside me there was peace. I knew I had fulfilled my duty, not only as a mother, but as a woman who did not allow her story to be erased. Jonathan came to visit me alone again, always bringing the boys. And in each visit, I noticed that his gaze towards me was different, less arrogant, more human. Little by little, the anger had given way to silent gratitude. He no longer talked about money, didn't talk about business. He just asked me if I was well, if I needed anything, if the boys were being a handful. And these simple questions had enormous value for me. It was proof that, even if slowly, he was learning. And maybe that was the true inheritance I was leaving. The lesson that love only exists when it comes accompanied by respect. On an afternoon with a reddish sky, I sat with my grandchildren on the porch and told stories from the past. I talked about how I met their grandfather, how I sewed the wedding dress for so many women in the village, how I fought to raise their father alone. They listened attentively, as if every word were a treasure. And at that instant, I realized that what I would leave for them would not fit in any courthouse document. The true inheritance was there, alive, in their curious eyes, in the memory they would keep of me not as a rigid woman, but as a grandmother who loved them above all else. Today, when I think about everything that happened, I feel that that Sunday when I heard my own son say that I didn't deserve anything I had was also the day I was reborn, because it was from that pain that I found my strength, my voice, and my courage to write, in life, the most important will. Not one of assets, but one of dignity. If one day someone opens that leather folder, they will find papers, yes, but they will also find the truth of a woman who never stopped fighting for respect. And that's what I want to remain. The certainty that a simple life can be great when it is lived with love, justice, and courage. Sometimes life puts us in front of difficult choices, and the true legacy we leave is not in material possessions, but in the respect we manage to cultivate and the dignity we don't give up. The story of Eleanor Miller reminds us of this with every gesture and every silence. And you, have you ever been through something similar? Have you ever had to be firm with someone you loved so you wouldn't lose yourself? Tell me in the comments, because sharing these experiences also helps others who may be going through something similar. If this story touched you, share it with someone who might need to hear these words today. Sometimes, a video arrives at the right time to open the eyes or warm the heart of someone on the other side. And if you want to follow more real stories like this, subscribe and stick around. Every story we tell here is an invitation to reflect on life, family, and the strength we carry within us.